talk about a potted history of paganism. So in prehistory, the first thing to note is that paganism wasn't called paganism back then, and that's because paganism was a part of everyday life. Your religion was, most people believed in the gods and the spirits that were immanent in nature, and people would go out and make offerings at the harvest. They would make offerings in their own home on the hearth, and the religious practices were just part of everyday life. They were part of what you did. So you went, you had a meal, you offered the first bit of the meal to the gods in your special place on your hearth. You had a harvest, you offered some of the harvest to the gods in thanks for the successful harvest. And if you opened up a new grain pit to store your grain in, then you had to make a small foundation sacrifice in the pit. And so quite often sacrifices were seen as like an emissary to the other world. And so yes, there was human sacrifice in prehistory, but it was probably pretty rare because nobody actually wants to bump off another member of the tribe, basically, because they're probably too useful and they might be your friend. It's also worth noting that the monument building practices, especially funerary monuments, changed over the vast period of time represented by the Stone Age all the way through to the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. So in the Stone Age, people were typically doing rock art in caves and shelters, and typically they would go into the deepest part of the cave and paint the animals that they were wanting to successfully hunt. So in the later part of the Stone Age, they start building large monuments and arranging stones, probably for calendar purposes. But also we know that the stone circles and places like that were meeting places for different tribes to come together, and they probably were used for trade as well as possibly sacred purposes. There's a lot of debate on this in the archaeological community, so you know, if you're interested in that, then obviously read up on the background. I can certainly recommend The Pagan Religions of the Ancient British Isles, which goes into considerable detail on the topic, and Pagan Britain, which I believe is an update of the Pagan Religions of the Ancient British Isles. It's like the second edition. So one of the things that at some point during the Stone Age, there was a transition in religious practices from the way that people would use burial mounds. So in the earlier part of the Stone Age, people would take in their dead, and it was only a select what they would do is they would actually select different bits of people and put them in different parts of the mound. And also before they were placed in the mound, they would have practiced excarnation, which is where you put somebody on a platform and then the birds come and eat the flesh, and then what you actually put in the burial mound is the bones that you want to venerate. So you might think that sounds really weird, but people were still doing this with bones of saints and things right into the Christian era, right? You can still go into certain cathedrals and find sort of mummified saints on display. So think on, right. Anyway, so in the Bronze Age, you actually start getting individual burial mounds, and this is where you get the sort of conical ones that look a bit like a little hill. And that practice continues into the Iron Age. And it's during the Iron Age, so you started getting conflict over resources in the Bronze Age, and that's when people started building hill forts and so on. And that continued well into the Iron Age. And of course, it's the point during the Iron Age, we get the Roman invasion of Britain. The Roman Empire takes over most of Europe. And it was actually the Romans who basically said, right, okay, everybody to the left of the Rhine is a Celt and everybody to the right of the Rhine is a German. And the Greeks, it was actually the Greeks who coined the term Celt. And there were many Celtic tribes all over Europe. You can usually spot them because their name starts with Gal. So like the book of Galatians in the Bible, the Galatians were a Celtic tribe. There are lots of exceptions to that, of course, but that is a general point. But I think the key thing we want to think about in this, that we can take away from this period, is that pagan religion was largely about propitiating the gods in the hope of, living longer and having enough to eat. And like I said, religion was part of everyday life. So people had specialist priests and shamans and sacred buildings, or or stone circles, but they didn't call what they were doing paganism. So the term pagan was actually coined by the Christians to designate those other people that aren't us, and the term means country dweller. So it's basically they were calling us kind of country bumpkins that weren't up with the times and the new religion. And it's interesting that there have been 14 popes called urban, which is the opposite of pagan, obviously. And there's also a lot of symbolism of the holy city in Christianity. So like there's a whole bit in the Bible where it talks about the heavenly city, and it's like the heavenly Jerusalem or something. But anyway, so paganism, that's really the fact that they were calling us pagans is where we get the idea of paganism as a nature religion, because it's to do with the countryside, so it must be a nature religion. Okay, so then we come to the so-called Dark Ages, which are now referred to by archaeologists and historians as the early Middle Ages. But that is a tad confusing because most people think of the early Middle Ages as starting like somewhere around the year 1100, whereas actually this takes it back to around the year 600. So I kind of stuck with the old name for reasons of not being confusing. But anyway, this is the period of the Viking raids, the Saxons. So when the Saxons first arrived in Britain, the Celtic inhabitants of Britain had been Christianized in the late Roman period. And then the Saxons show up and they're still pagan. So then we have huge areas of southern Britain that have gone back to being pagan. And there's a great book called The Way of Weird by Brian Bates, which tries to recreate the world of the Saxon pagans. And it's a great book, highly recommended. And also in this period, obviously the Vikings are going out raiding, but importantly, they're also trading around vast areas like the Baltic, down the Danube, all the way to Byzantium, which they called Mecklenburg. Obviously, this period is characterized by a transition to Christianity, and it wasn't all peaceful. People didn't just go, "Oh, I like this shiny new religion, I think I'll go for that." No, it took a good number of decades, and in the Baltic and that whole area, they still celebrate a festival called the day, which basically translates as the day we slaughtered the pagans. And there were thousands of pagans killed in this thing. And so there was three separate crusades. There was the Prussian Crusade, in which the Teutonic Knights basically invaded Prussia and slaughtered all of the pagan inhabitants, which was most of the people of Prussia. They also invaded Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia, and most of northern Poland, and they did their level best to wipe out the pagans in these crusades. So never let anyone tell you that the transition to Christianity was all peaceful and nice and just kind of fluffy. No, it was violent. And typically what they would do is they would get the local lord, like by through intermarriage or wanting to join the new club. And then when the local lord converted, then all the peasants had to convert too. But in the case of the Baltic and Prussia, the transition was extremely violent. So as a result of all this violence, quite naturally, paganism goes underground. It doesn't get wiped out entirely because people are still practicing folklore, and it is not, we don't really know to what extent people still remembered the old gods. But what's really interesting to me is that all around Europe, Wednesday is named either named after Odin or Woden or Mercury. And so we have Wednesday, Woden's Day. We have miércoles in Spanish, mercredi in French. Miércoles. Yeah, miércoles is Spanish for Wednesday, yes. And in German, it's called Mittwoch, which means middle of the week. So clearly they really, really wanted people to forget about Odin. So that's how powerful paganism still was. And even right into the 12th, 13th century, the authors of penitentiaries, which were volumes of canon law that dished out penances for people who behaved badly, they were dishing out penances for people engaging in pagan practices throughout the early Middle Ages into the 11th, 12th century. After that, it got really nasty and people started actually rounding up heretics and witches and setting fire to them. So, but anyway, paganism basically went underground and became folk magic, folklore. There was also an intellectual movement to do magic in the form of alchemy and natural philosophy. And of course, this was given a kind of Christian veneer to make it respectable, but at heart, it's kind of pagan, right? There was persecution, especially of people who were deemed to be witches. Now, it is important to note that during the early Middle Ages, the Christians took the view that witches didn't exist and said, right, you pagans who've been persecuting witches, you stop that, it's silly. And it's only in the later Middle Ages that the Christians actually start persecuting witches themselves. So remember the previous slide, we talked about the Prussian Crusades and the Baltic Crusades. These crusades, which basically meant that the Teutonic Knights could just go in and take over vast swathes of territory, resulted in the doctrine of terra nullius, which is basically the idea that if a piece of land is occupied by pagans, then it's okay for Christians to come in and take it over by force. And it was around this time that very conveniently North America was discovered, and the doctrine of terra nullius was applied to North America because indigenous people here were deemed to be pagans and therefore not worthy to own their own land, and so the Christians could just waltz in and take it over. And you know, there are still colonial countries that have not yet repudiated the doctrine of terra nullius, which is very wrong, and it needs to be repudiated, and the Pope needs to repudiate it as well, because it is still doctrine of the Catholic Church and it is still affecting and impacting indigenous peoples today. And you know, Prussia is inhabited by the descendants of those Teutonic knights rather than the pagans that got wiped out. So this is, you know, it's a serious live issue. Okay. I plumped Giordano Bruno in here because Giordano Bruno in around 1600 actually decided to declare himself to be a pantheist, and that the divine was immanent in nature. And as a result, he got burnt at the stake. But his writings were really important for Hermetic magic and, you know, future developments in the occult and paganism. And then around this time, so the Renaissance actually kind of lasted for about 4 centuries, depending on where you are. So if you, like, it starts off in the 1200s in Italy, and is ironically enough a result of the Crusades, because when people went to Israel and started the Crusades, they came into contact with Muslim civilization, and the Muslim civilization had not only preserved but also developed the mathematical and literary and cultural ideas that they'd got from the ancient Greeks. And, you know, there's a lot of talk that Islam merely preserved this knowledge. No, they developed it. That's really important. But anyway, that knowledge arrives in Europe and completely sweeps away the scholasticist views of the previous generation, and there's a whole flowering of ideas based on this new knowledge and the newly available Greek texts and also newly available Arabic texts that arrive in Europe at this time. And eventually the Renaissance arrives in that little backwater known as England, where in about 1600. So it took a while to get to the UK. Anyway, which wasn't the UK at the time because England and Scotland hadn't united. So yeah, Renaissance, very important. And it was with the Renaissance that we actually start getting more people interested in classical paganism, which is why it's relevant here. Okay, so from there, we start to get, so most of the 1600s in Britain were taken up with fighting the Civil War and getting rid of the Puritans and that kind of stuff. Once they'd got that out of the way, people started settling down to a nice period of building nice country houses and stuff. Unfortunately, the reason they suddenly had all this money to build all these country houses was because they were taking over most of North America, enslaving half the people of Africa, and making lots of money by selling human beings to plantations in North America. So actually the bucolic, calm image that we have of Britain in the 1700s is actually a big lie. I don't know if the estate in this particular picture was built on the back of slave money, but some of them definitely were. So anyway, but the point is, I never said I was going to make this potted history kind of, you know, definitely not erasing the bad bits. So anyways, we have the Enlightenment, which is following on from the Renaissance, really. And the Enlightenment was all about being rational and going back to the classical Greek ideas, hence the fancy Greek-looking buildings in these gardens. And at this time, people also became really interested in the Druids. Now, in the 18th century, people thought that the ancient Druids were actually some kind of lost tribe of Israel or something. But they did go around looking at all the stone circles, especially a guy called William Stukeley, who went around and mapped a lot of things like Avebury and other stone circles in England. And we get a classical revival at this time. So people were really interested in classical architecture, literature, and ideas, including paganism. But at this point, it's more of an intellectual approach. Okay, we then get into the Romantic period. Now, the thing about the Romantics is that a lot of the time they were looking to the Gothic period, so the late flowering of the Middle Ages. And so they were more interested in Christianity, but they were interested in specific ethnic cultures. And the early period of Romanticism was called Sturm und Drang in Germany, and that was the transition period from the Enlightenment into Romanticism. And it was called Sturm und Drang because they were really interested in the concept of the sublime, which is that sense of awe that you get when you go out into nature and you see an amazing mountain or a really wild place. Because previously people weren't that into wilderness. They thought it was a bit scary and full of wolves. And then suddenly people are like, oh, I'm getting this amazing experience of the sublime. And so they got really into it. So because of the renewed interest in that, we get more interest in nature religion. And because of the renewed interest in national ethnic culture, we get the folklore revival. And of course, because there's lots of pagan ideas lurking about in folklore, that meant that there were more people interested in paganism as well. And the quite interesting thing about pagan ideas in the late 19th century is that they were quite closely intertwined with socialism. You get this fantastic poster for May Day 1890 something by Walter Crane called A Garland for the Workers, and it's got sort of a goddess with beautiful sheaves of corn, and on each ribbon around this sheaf of corn is things like reasonable pay, time off, an 8-hour working day, and other good things that we now take for granted that the trade unions got for us. And so there was a real thing that early socialism and paganism were really closely intertwined, and nowhere more so, I would argue, than in the person of Edward Carpenter. Now, Edward Carpenter is a bit of a hero of mine. He was a gay, pagan, vegetarian socialist who lived openly with his lover, George Merrill, and actually inspired the novel Maurice by E.M. Forster, and wrote amazing poetry and really promoted the idea of paganism as a return to the wilderness. So very important, for the early pagan revival. Another important strand in this is Rudyard Kipling, author of Puck of Pook's Hill, which is the book that turned me into a pagan, well, I guess I was already a pagan, but it made me realise that I was a pagan, and still am, last time I checked. Now, interestingly enough, Kipling's uncle was Edward Burne-Jones, who he knew as Uncle Ned. So there's a direct link between Kipling and the Pre-Raphaelites. And the Pre-Raphaelites were painting beautiful pictures of nature that were very true to life. And they also had a lot of paintings of the myths of King Arthur. And the artist John William Waterhouse painted a lot of nature spirits and witches and nereids and mermaids, and he obviously liked water a lot, and quite a few of them painted witchy sort of pictures, so they were clearly a bit interested in pagan stuff. And then we have an explicit example of paganism in the form of Rupert Brooke and his group of friends who were called the Neo-Pagans, and they used to hang out on Grantchester Meadows having a good time and discussing paganism. And it's interesting to think what that would have turned into if Rupert Brooke had survived the First World War. And also at this time, like throughout the late 19th century and into the early 20th century, we have the we have the occult revival. So in the late 19th century, everybody who was anybody was either in the Golden Dawn, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, or they were in the Theosophical Society. Like famous people like Oscar Wilde and Alan Bennett and so on and so forth. So, and also around 1900, was kind of early, sometime during the 1920s, Druidry actually goes back to its pagan roots. So it ceases to be a universalist type of thing and becomes much more pagan oriented. Okay, and we come to the 20th century. So in the 20th century, we get the rise of Wicca, which I have dealt with extensively in my other video, the rebirth of witchcraft and the adolescence of witchcraft and the coming of age of witchcraft. We get the rise of Druidry. It's a well-known fact that Ross Nichols and Gerald Gardner were best mates and used to hang out together in their nudist colony at Spielplatz, which is in Hertfordshire. Later on, we get the rise of heathenry. That was sometime around the 60s. And then kind of late 20th century, we start getting more people interested in traditional witchcraft. I mean, obviously, traditional witchcraft had been there throughout the 20th century, but it was very kind of secretive. And only more recently has it felt able to come out of the broom closet and appear on the internet and so on. And all of these strands were accompanied and mutually encouraged by feminism, environmentalism, the hippie movement, and eco-pagans. And the road protests of the 1980s and 90s and the Greenham Common protests were very important in that side of things. We also start to get pagan organizations arising, like the Pagan Federation and the Children of Artemis in the UK, Covenant of the Goddess in North America. Very important before the internet was Green Egg magazine. People used to write to each other and have, you know, arguments back and forth in the pages of Green Egg magazine, rather slower than the average internet forum, obviously. And I also think that the rise of interest in science fiction and probably fantasy as well is important in this process, because Green Egg was originally the magazine of the Church of All Worlds, which was founded by a couple of guys who, in the 60s in the US, you had to go to church on Sunday or have some religious practice on Sunday. And so they were like, well, I don't want to go to church, so we'll just do our own thing. So they kind of invented their own religion. And then lots of people came because they didn't want to go to church either. And then it ended up turning into a real religion. I think it's still going, which is pretty cool. So there you go. It was a very whistle-stop tour of the 20th century. 21st century. This is actually a nice sunset, but I did choose this image because obviously recently we've had the awful wildfires in California and the sky actually went that colour like at noon, which is kind of terrifying. So 21st century, we have the rise of the internet, social media around 2000. So I think Facebook started in 2006, but didn't really kick off and become absolutely humongous until everybody got a smartphone in around 2011 and you could access social media sites on your smartphone. Clearly the pandemic has made a big difference because it shifted us much more. I mean, we already had lots and lots of online communities, Facebook groups and all kinds of, you know, prior to that, there were message boards and forums and so on and so forth. But because of the pandemic, we've had to start doing much more in the way of online networking through video and online rituals and so on. And I think the key themes during the 21st century, certainly so far, have been climate change, politics, inclusion of minorities and the marginalised. There's been a lot of protest, which pagans have been involved in. And I think that social justice will be a key theme. It's certainly a key theme right now. So other aspects of pagan ideas that have emerged in the 21st century been an increased focus on polytheism, because in the 20th century nobody really minded whether you literally believed in the gods or not. You could kind of all show up to the same ritual and it didn't matter what you literally believed. Now that the pagan community is so much bigger, we can now afford to kind of go into groups where, like, some people literally believe in the gods and tailor their rituals accordingly. So you get lots of polytheist groups. And then because of that, in some ways, we now have an explicitly atheo-pagan group. So where pagans who are atheists can get together and do ritual the way they want to do ritual, which is much more focused on, I guess, connecting with nature as a whole and, to a certain extent, self-empowerment. If you're interested in that, check out the Atheo-Paganism website, which is run by Mark Green, who is also very good on social justice issues. So, excellent. The rise of folkloric witchcraft, which some people call it traditional witchcraft. I think that's a confusing term, so I use the term folkloric. Obviously, Wicca is also inspired by folklore, but when we say folkloric witchcraft, we mean like Clan of Tubal Cain and 1734 tradition and Roebuck and so on and so forth. And also, because of the availability of many more books and websites on the subject, we've got lots more solitary witchcraft going on. So yeah, 21st century, there you go. Further reading, fun. So Karen Armstrong, I haven't read this, but I must get hold of it because I like Karen Armstrong. Short History of Myth. Ronald Hutton, Pagan Religions of the Ancient British Isles. I think Pagan Britain is the second edition of that. But if you're a Ronald Hutton completist, then you obviously want both. Stations of the Sun, The Ritual Year in Britain. Fantastic book. You wouldn't believe how many folk customs there are to do with Christmas. It's amazing. Haven't read this one yet. Must get around to it at some point. Here we have A History of Pagan Europe by Prudence Jones and Nigel Pennick. Very comprehensive history of paganism in Europe. Ronald Hutton on the Druids, and he mentioned to me that the Druids is like the popular version of Blood and Mistletoe, which is the full-blown academic thing. But again, if you're a completist, you clearly want both. Graham Harvey's Contemporary Paganism, which used to have the subtitle Listening People Speaking Earth, which I rather liked, and Graham Harvey on Animism. So do check out my other videos. These are the potted history of witchcraft ones: witchcraft in antiquity, witchcraft in the medieval and early modern periods, the rebirth of witchcraft, the adolescence of witchcraft, and the coming of age of witchcraft. And I've also got one on key ideas in paganism, and recently done one on recovering from fundamentalism as well. And finally, check out my books: Dark Mirror, The Inner Work of Witchcraft, and The Night Journey, Witchcraft as Transformation, which are available from the Doreen Valiente Foundation online shop, which is shop.doreenvaliente.org. Okay, hope you enjoyed this episode of The Witch's Mirror. Take care, and we'll see you soon. Blessed be.